I'm standing on Corinth, one of the huge outcroppings of rock that stick up from the Corinthia, the isthmus that connects the Peloponnese to the mainland of Greece. Below me you can see the city of Corinth. Now Corinth was a cultural and economic crossroads for the ancient Mediterranean, connecting the east and the western parts of the Roman Empire. Paul's letters to the Corinthians that we find in the New Testament give us a glimpse into what the early Christian community at the city might have been like. In these letters we see a small Christian community regularly dining together. We see figures such as Gaius and Chloe hosting these gatherings at what Paul calls house churches. Here he uses the term oikos, which can refer to any sort of domicile or dwelling. But what do we mean by house church? Houses were certainly different in antiquity than they are now. And even the term church brings to mind modern conceptions of official gatherings at a church building. What did the early Christian gatherings in this city look like? Where did they meet? And when did the small house church give way to the large basilica? To answer these questions, we need to look at both the textual and archaeological evidence from the 1st century CE. Now, Paul's letters are among the earliest evidence we have for ancient Christianity, and he mentions house churches on several occasions. However, he seems to imply that these meeting places were in houses of relatively wealthy people. In fact, many scholars hypothesize that the people Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians, Gaius, Crispus, Chloe, Phoebe, were wealthy homeowners in their own right. Indeed, by referencing Chloe and her people in 1 Corinthians, we can guess that she was a wealthy elite Corinthian with her own household staff, possibly with a professional relationship with Paul. So what would a wealthy elite house look like in the Roman Empire? We have evidence from all over the Mediterranean. For example, in Ephesus, archaeologists have been excavating wealthy dwellings built into the foot of the mountain overlooking Ephesus. These so-called terrace houses date to the 1st century CE, about the same time that Paul was traveling around the Mediterranean. To top it off, these houses are extremely opulent, with mosaic floors and paintings on the walls that survive to this day. Whoever lived in these houses definitely must have been the upper crust of Ephesian society. Now, we have no evidence that Christians were meeting in these Ephesian terrace houses. However, we can use them as an example to try to imagine what household meetings might have looked like held at elite houses. These particular houses have interior courtyards with an open ceiling. The ground floor had living rooms, dining rooms, and guest rooms, so they were definitely large enough to accommodate a gathering. And it was probably a source of pride for a local nobleman or noblewoman to host the local congregation, considering that society in the Roman Empire was predicated upon a system of patronage, meaning wealthy elites and politicians donating time and money to the community in exchange for prestige. But even though many of the Pauline communities met in wealthy villas, this probably was not universal. We have evidence of Jewish communities repurposing more humble domestic space for their religious gatherings. Archaeological evidence from all over the empire, including Rome and Delos, indicate that many synagogues were originally constructed as smaller homes and converted into meeting spaces. We see this in the ancient city of Priene, located a few miles outside of Ephesus. Located in the residential sector of this small city, archaeologists discovered a synagogue that might have only held 20 people. With benches lining the walls and a Torah niche in the corner, we can see that ancient Jews used this space for their own communal gatherings right in the middle of a neighborhood. Although it is not entirely accurate to compare house churches with Jewish synagogues in the 1st century CE, we can use the example at Priene to show that religious communities in antiquity repurposed a variety of buildings for their own religious gatherings, whether that was a large elite household or a smaller domestic space. So, if Jews and Christians used a variety of buildings, can we say that the Christian house church was the universal norm for these religious gatherings? The houses of Gaius and Crispus may have been large ornate villas like we see at Ephesus, but scholars doubt that they would have been able to accommodate the size of the entire Christian population of Corinth. Where else could they have met? The vast majority of people living under Roman rule were extremely poor. Instead of living in wealthy houses like we see at Ephesus, they were living in multi-story apartment-style buildings called insulae. Roman authors like Strabo say that insulae were mass-produced, oftentimes constructed with less sturdy materials like mud brick or timber. Since they were not constructed of marble, like the palaces and temples of the elite, these buildings simply don't exist anymore for archaeologists to discover. However, we can assume that every major city in the Roman Empire, including Corinth, had these apartment-style buildings for the urban poor. Ostia, which is the port of Rome, has the best preserved ruins of insulae, showing that these buildings stretched up to 3 or 4 stories. Scholars hypothesize that the population of Ostia reached about 27,000 people, with the vast majority living in these insulae, perhaps as many as 20,000 people. So if we assume that most Christians were living in insulae, how do they factor into early Christian gatherings? The elites of the city would have owned the insulae, renting out the upper spaces for domiciles and the lower spaces for industrial purposes, craftsmen and artisans. There is evidence that professional guilds in the Roman Empire rented out space like this for their monthly meetings. So if an early Christian group needed a place to meet, there is a good chance that these rental spaces would have been available to them, especially if most of the Christians were living in the upper stories of insulae. Although there is no direct evidence of these so-called apartment churches, some scholars feel it is the best explanation to account for the vast majority of the Greco-Roman population, especially after the Christian population started to grow beyond what an elite villa could have realistically held. At the very least, we need to account for the multiplicity of buildings that Christians may have used for their gatherings, not simply assuming that it was always a house or a wealthy villa. But how do we get from here to here? By the 3rd century CE, Christianity had grown tremendously, but they didn't start building huge basilicas until around the 4th century. Now, Christians probably continued meeting in poor and wealthy houses, but archaeologists have discovered evidence for dedicated worship spaces starting to be used by the 3rd century CE. Our earliest evidence is the church at Dura-Europos, a small city on the extreme edge of the Roman Empire in modern-day Syria. Like the Priene synagogue, the Dura-Europos church is a converted residential building, probably converted sometime in the mid-3rd century. However, unlike the Priene synagogue, the Dura church exhibits more extensive architectural changes meant for religious gatherings, including a baptistry, a large meeting room, and religious wall paintings. The frescoes on the wall include depictions of the healing of the paralytic man in Mark 2, and the famous story of Peter and Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee, confirming the original inhabitants were probably Christians. What is significant about the Dura church is that it is a completely repurposed building. Christians were no longer simply meeting in houses or renting out space, but they were using dedicated worship space by the 3rd century, a space with the primary function of housing a Christian gathering. In many respects, this is the precursor to the basilicas that we see in later centuries. Our textual and archaeological evidence shows that Christians used a multiplicity of buildings for their religious gatherings. The so-called Christian house church might have taken several forms, from the huge elite complexes of the wealthy aristocracy to the more basic industrial space under the apartments of the urban sprawl of Roman cities. This not only illustrates how Christianity functioned in the urban centers of the Roman Empire, but it also emphasizes the social aspect of the early Jesus movement, how these people intentionally sought out communal space for their rituals and their worship in a religiously and culturally diverse city. As usual, thanks for watching and please subscribe. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that footage from Corinth that I shot this summer when I was overseas in Greece. If you want more information on Christian house churches, I suggest you check out my blog over here, religionforbreakfast.com. I go into a little bit more detail and have some bibliographic references if you want to do some research. And as usual, you can subscribe to my YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter if you want to keep up with these video blogs.